Welcome to the Women in Observability panel, Then, Now, and Beyond, a partnership with DZone and Chronosphere. We're here in honor of the 111th International Women's Day. I'm Paige Cruz, and I'll be moderating. On the panel today, we've got Amy Boyle, a principal software engineer at New Relic, Adriana Villela, a senior developer advocate over at Lightstep, and Julia Blaze, a product manager at Chronosphere. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your expertise. We want to reflect on your journey with observability throughout your career. And first, I would love to know what signals, whether it be metrics, logs, traces, what signals or tools did you rely on at the beginning of your career? And is there any feature or particular visualization that you miss from today's tools? And we'll get started with Julia.
Hi, thank you so much, Paige, and nice to meet everyone here. It's so funny, thinking back to the beginning of my career in tech. Well, the very beginning of my career, I was an art historian. So there was kind of a winding journey through finance and museums and research data back into the tech world. But when I first joined a tech company, I was really in a customer-facing role, and I was often working on high security systems that were in air-gapped or classified spaces. So the first time I really started to use observability, I would be on the phone with someone and I would say, hey, my software, this customer is reporting a problem. And they would say, okay, what I need you to do, because I don't have a clearance, I can't come on site, I can't access the system, but I'm the engineer who built it. So what I need you to do is SSH to this box and grep through a bunch of information to find this word, and then tell me what you see around that word. Repeat that back to me, and we're going to try to debug this from a distance together. So I really started out with logs and this kind of strange introduction to the observability world. It was fascinating, though. It was just a really odd introduction. Over time, I think I grew to use a lot of Prometheus Grafana, and that was something that you could deploy into that sort of high security environment and use. And I learned to read metrics output. I learned what a CPU was over time, and then eventually made my way back into the product and then directly into the observability space. But maybe a non-traditional introduction to observability.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, how fascinating. We will talk more about that. Amy, would you like to share your first signal that you used back in the day?
Sure. So I started off doing software development for neuroscience research. I worked in a couple of different labs, and that was basically working on desktop apps. And so there's kind of like two things I really used. One was logs, actually. Like I didn't actually really even know about the concept of metrics or traces or anything like that. All I had was like the log files, or just sitting down physically with someone and watching them walk me through a bug or what was slow on my application, and just physically observing.
Mm-hmm.
So going and working at a monitoring tech company was a pretty big jump, and just like blew my mind how much there was out there when I started to learn about like, oh, this stuff you can either, metrics and events and auto instrumentation that reports up to the cloud. And that was pretty exciting for me when I started exploring that world, and that's grown a ton as well, even since the several years I've been doing that in that world.
Yeah, our space changes so rapidly. And Adriana, wrap us up with your first tool or signal that you leaned on.
Yeah, I'd say, I guess, console print statements and logs, like from the early days. I'm dating myself. QBasic was my first programming language. So definitely relied heavily on console outputs. And then I spent 16 years as a Java developer. So logs were like my life, right? When debugging, and also did a bunch of database development. So leveraging those select statements, I got really, really good at Oracle, complex Oracle SQL queries to help debug. I journeyed into the observability world actually when I took on, so my position prior to where I'm at now, I managed a couple of teams at Two Cows. I managed a platform team and an observability practices team. And I had some inkling of observability when I joined, But I found myself in a position where I had to level up pretty fast. So I did a bunch of reading and I blogged about my experience basically. So I would say, I guess my next signal after logging was really traces. That's where, for me, I fell in love with traces. And I'm like, oh my God, this tells you like the end-to-end story of like your system. So for me, that blew my mind. And then it was kind of cool that I ended up working for an observability vendor as the next step of my career. So yeah, that's how I wound up here.
I love it. And we have such a good cross-section of observability companies represented today that we all work at, which is one of the really exciting things about this panel, to get to talk across companies. So we've covered this a little bit, but were there any particular early projects or events that got you interested in observability, or what led you to apply to the companies that you work for today?
Like I said, like for me, because I was blogging about like my observability experience, I got a message from my now boss after I posted a blog post on Twitter. And he's like, hey, how would you like to do this for a living? And I'm like, would I? This sounds like the best thing ever. So that's how I ended up at Lightstep. And Lightstep was one of the companies that I've been following. So I was pretty excited to be working with some people that like I knew about and admired from afar.
Oh my gosh, a tweet landed a job. I love it.
It was so cool. That's so unexpected.
And Amy, what brought you to New Relic outside of the neuro world?
So I had like, I would dabble in like creating my own like little web applications and things like that. And I was aware of New Relic because they have a Portland office. And I'd been going to, occasional meetups, and they would often host meetups and things like that. So I'd heard about them. And so I had someone kind of point them out to me, and I decided to, try it out. I'm like, see what it sounds interesting, see what's about. And so I had like a little Flask app of mine that I just built, I think. And I think it was like a little recommendation engine that I just built as a little toy. And I had installed like the New Relic agent and like logged in, and I was just like amazed. I'm like, this is magic. Like it's monitoring my app in real time. And all I did was like, pip install. And I was just like, it kind of like it blew my mind a little bit. I'm like, this is really interesting, and I want to know how it was done. And yeah, I ended up applying for and getting a position on the Python agent. And so getting to kind of dive deep into like how are we hooking in and getting those metrics.
Oh, lovely. And you followed that curiosity past the Python agent team. And now I believe you work on, I want to say Kafka ingest. You got to correct me.
I work on, so like the backend streaming data pipelines. So it's kind of like right in the middle. It's usually streaming, query, metric aggregation, that sorts of things. You do use a lot of Kafka.
Yeah, where all the action is. And Julia, you had a long and winding path. What got Chronosphere on your radar?
Yeah, so some early projects that I think got me really interested in observability and put me on the path were really starting to work on the product side of things. So I started in that customer facing role, moved to the product side of the organization, which is really where I first learned that, metrics and logs didn't observe from nothing, you instrumented them. And I was so intrigued. And I have to say, I worked with some great developers who really walked me through how this works and what you can learn from observability in depth. Had the opportunity to then go work on the central observability team for my previous company as a product and project manager for them. And I think I just kind of fell down this well of interest in learning how software worked. I think that was kind of a theme in my life. I always wanted to know not just that the car ran because there was an engine in it, but how do fuel injection engines work? And what does a piston do? And why do we have these different grades of gasoline? And, I always kind of want to go to the root of a system and know why it's functioning. And I think working on that observability team, I really saw that that's the insight you got into software from being deep into the observability world and seeing how it's produced and collected and then presented back to engineers for them to make use of it. So when the opportunity came through a friend who had actually been working at Chronosphere, when the opportunity came to come work directly for a company where that was all they did full time every day, I was so excited. I was just like, well, this is heaven. I get to spend all of my time in this world of understanding and translating it for other people.
Oh yeah, the rabbit hole goes deep, and it is a happy rabbit hole that I am in. I am on my third observability company, and it's just very meta to explain to people, oh, I work on a product, on software that monitors other software. It gets kind of fun explaining it to folks outside of the industry. Thank you for all of the reflections. Let us switch gears to present day. There are many misconceptions about both monitoring and observability, from simply how to define them or whether push versus pull-based systems are better. Let's talk about observability practices or paradigms that are holding organizations back today. What have you seen or heard anecdotally or read on a Reddit thread? Let's start with Adriana.
So I can speak for from firsthand experience at an organization that I worked at, where I'd say one of the biggest challenges was getting teams to instrument their own code, because I think companies end up in this sort of chicken and egg situation whereby things are on fire, and so they know they need observability, and in order to leverage observability, you have to instrument their code, but they don't have time to instrument their code because things are on fire. And so then they have this tendency of going, oh, let's go to the SRE team, or let's go to the observability team, and why don't you guys instrument code for us? And of course, I'd say that is the most terrible practice ever, because these people aren't intimate with your code. They don't know what needs to be instrumented. So that holds people back. And the other one that I would say that I've seen is this idea that, so some people come from the old school, monitoring background of let's have a bunch of big ass monitors on a wall with a bunch of dashboards, and let's stare at them all day and see if something breaks. And to me, I feel like that's an observability anti-pattern. But yet a lot of organizations that claim to, want to practice observability, they still find themselves in that situation where they are beholden to the wall o monitors. And again, I feel like that prevents them from really moving past the old way of thinking and into the new paradigm shift of observability, where really it's about following those breadcrumbs to answer the question, why is this happening? And I don't feel like monitors, dashboards necessarily give you all of that.
Could not agree more. Amy, what are your thoughts?
I'm thinking, so I think this kind of general approach, maybe a mindset, and thinking about observability as part of the development process. Some of the things that I feel like I've run into are kind of being surprised by things after the fact, and needing to think about testing. You have your testable code, thinking about observable code, and when you're making a change, how do you already have the signals in place that you're going to be able to sort of know what happened, know both the impact from, say, performance perspective, but also maybe from customer impact sort of perspective, and really thinking about it as part of when you're writing the software, can I build this in? And that kind of ties in a little bit, I think, with what Adriana was saying, which is if you make it part of your development process, that you it grows more organically than having to come in and just sweep through and try to make your code observable in a sort of disjoint sort of way.
I'm hearing instrument as you go. Lots of good strategies here. And Julia, what have you seen in the field as far as practices or paradigms holding organizations back from unleashing true observability?
Oh, wow. So some practices and paradigms I see in the field that maybe hold people back include, the first two things that come to mind are things that I think Adriana and Amy mentioned. The first phrase that popped into my head is more data is better data. right? And Adriana, I think of your wall of monitors, right? This is the classic network operations center. I'll just put more lines on the graph. I'll have more graphs in front of my team. I'll put them in a big round room and surround them with monitors. And if we have all the data, we'll definitely catch and fix the problems. And I just think that's so not true. It's right. It's the right data at the right time in the right context. And that's really the key to observability. And the other one, of course, is observability comes last, and I think that really holds people back is right before we roll out, did we instrument that code? Oh, let's add some things and then we'll ship it and it'll be fine. And I see this even with handoff, right? Like in today's architecture, when we have microservices and they change hands and teams all of the time, the last thing you do in handoff is say, hey, what signals are valuable for this particular service? What's a sign things are going wrong? I rarely hear that as part of handoff conversations, even in our own company. And I think that's so important because if you've worked with a service before and you've seen it experience, severe incidents and issues, you can tell that next team, here's what to look for. Here is the right data in the right context to put in the right monitor so that you catch bad things before it happens. So I think those are the two things that come to mind first. I'll also add a very small thing, but the other thing I hear is no one will use traces. And I think that's so sad. Adriana, you mentioned the magic of seeing a distributed trace. And I think, I do think that not many people use traces. I think sometimes we just say, here's a bunch of tracing instrumentation, have at it. No one has time to learn it from the ground up. But if you can say to an engineer, remember that incident you had last week? You looked at this and then you did that. And 3 hours later, you found this. I'm looking at your traces for that time and I see this. And that points me to this. And 5 minutes in, I'm at the root cause that it took you this much time to find in other ways. So I think if we can do better workflow-based education, many people will and can use traces, and they're a very powerful part of your observability infrastructure that is, to me, underutilized today.
I could not agree more. And a really interesting disconnect that I hear is for folks of us that work in observability companies, we have been working on tracing products, the last 4 or 5 years. And so for us, these conversations and thinking about tracing and workflows is almost common, almost mainstream. And then you talk to folks that are software engineers at non-observability companies, and they are just at the beginning of tracing. They're skeptical of tracing. And so I am with you that education is the bridge that we need to bridge that gap between the old paradigm of metrics and logs, which are still totally useful, but to get to this next level and seeing the end-to-end request, I'd love a trace. And that is a great segue to our next question, which is, it is a really exciting time for specifically open source instrumentation with the development and adoption of open telemetry, of course, for tracing and metrics, Prometheus, eBPF, and so many more. What, in your opinion, do organizations need to keep in mind when they explore OSS instrumentation? Let's start with Julia.
Sure. So I think a big thing that organizations need to keep in mind when they transition to OSS instrumentation is that it can initially feel like a downgrade. I think if you've been using proprietary software and systems, you understand how things work, you're probably very comfortable with them, your devs speak that language. And even though there's so much power in OSS technologies, from being able to be more flexible, more creative, leveraging that open source community, which is very strong these days in the observability world. And also even in being able to deploy your own releases and manage all of that yourself. There's so much power, but you also have to learn all of the languages of the open source technologies. And I think initially, if you do that transition fast, and I think to our point about education earlier, if you don't go into it understanding that you're going to need to educate your teams about how this works, it can initially feel rough and feel like a bit of a downgrade. But I encourage people to, work with their teams in advance, educate them, show them the power of this, and just support them through that transition. Because once you're on that page, I think the power is just really evident to everyone using it.
Absolutely. And Amy, you at New Relic started on the Python agent. So I know you're very intimately familiar with all that it takes to instrument just one language in the framework ecosystem. What are your thoughts on this new OSS instrumentation agent world, or agentless in the case of eBPF?
So I think it's really exciting. I think it's going to allow us to, as an industry, try to help standardize on things and some of the especially. And I think that when it comes to like what's holding companies back, I think it depends on whether they're a small or large company. Like smaller companies, just getting some metrics in can be really important when you don't have anything. But like with some of like the larger ones or the more mature, discoverability and portability tend to be like a really bigger issue. And I think that the OSS tooling can help with us with that kind of both within companies and as an industry to try to be like, this is, we'll start getting a little bit more standard on the way that we have our data models or maybe even some of our naming. And I think, even as a vendor, it can help us free up maybe make some of those data model decisions for us, which sometimes can be challenging. But I think it also will kind of allow us to focus on like what the real value add for us and our products are. If we race and not just that we've got you locked in because you've embedded our code into your code and you've got a vendor lock-in. So I think it helps drive better products, actually, as well.
Absolutely. I'm very excited about the world of instrument once and never again. Or decorate later. Instrumentation won't go away, but I would love for developers to focus on adding that the business value span context or logs and all of that jazz. And Adriana, what are your thoughts here? I know you're quite active with OpenTelemetry, so I have a suspicion that might be your favorite product or tool.
Yeah, definitely. Big advocate of OpenTelemetry. Even before I joined Lightstep, I would say getting into the open source tooling can always be scary, and I've experienced it working at large enterprises where they're like, wait, I'm not paying a vendor for this. This is kind of weird. And they're almost like looking for someone to throw money at. But it's like, if you write Java, like Maven and Gradle for building your jars, like they're open source tools, there's no one to pay for this. So like, on the same thread, like using any open source tooling, like when you're deciding to use it, I think you have to ask yourself, like, you have to understand what you're getting into, right? Like when I was at Two Cows, I ran the observability practices team there, and I wanted everyone in the organization to switch from using a vendor provided SDK for instrumenting their code to using OpenTelemetry, so that it would give everyone that freedom to switch. If they wanted to switch to another vendor, they could. But it also meant knowing what it was that we were getting into. So how widespread is OpenTelemetry? Is this thing going to stick around, right? How many people are using it? And these are all really, really valid questions. And if you're a large organization, or maybe even a small organization, looking into tooling like that, you will want to answer those questions or know the answers to those questions. The other thing I would say is, if you are venturing into the world of using open source tooling, I think it's important to know, like, how often is this thing maintained, right? Like how often are people contributing to it? But also, if you're going to be using it, encouraging folks in your organization to contribute to it. Like at my previous job, I remember there were a couple of issues with, I forget, I think it was like something in the OpenTelemetry collector, and my team was like, oh, we're waiting on a fix for blah blah blah, and I'm like, well, why don't we put in a fix for this so that we can move things along? Like, we're reaping the benefits, but let's also contribute to it and make it better.
Yes, I think that is the beautiful part of open source, is that it should be both a give and a take. And I think about how Terraform did a great job opening up their providers. And when I was at Lightstep, we worked on the Terraform provider for CodeFresh, and being able to write our own tooling to serve our needs and then contribute it back was really rewarding, as like personally, and for obviously our company. And it was wonderful to get to share that with everybody. So I totally agree with you there. And since we have such a lovely cross-section of roles, I'd love to hear how you use observability data in your day-to-day to help make decisions or plan. And Amy, I think you might have the most straightforward use case of all of us, but share when the observability data comes up for you and how you put it to work.
Yeah, so I'm an engineer and architect now, so it's kind of two different flavors of similar things. So it's going to be either I'm working on something, either working on a prototype or pairing with the team, and I'm looking at either some existing metrics or I'm adding some as part of that work. Part of being doing that is this having a performance impact, looking at CPU, memory, bytes in and out type stuff, as well as any sort of metrics that they've added that'll tell me whether or not the functional impact is happening. I'll also take a step back sometimes and think about what is the direction for our software that we need to take? Where are our large data flows coming in? How much are these different paths being used? So when thinking about kind of more of the strategic level of design when it comes to software, making sure I can understand, I use the monitoring to make sure that I can understand our system, how it works, so that I can see, so that I can design the best direction for it to go in as well.
Sounds like a very essential part of your toolkit. And Julia, how do you, as a product manager, use or rely on observability data?
As a product manager, I think I rely on observability data quite often for that kind of strategic planning and direction that you were talking about, Amy. Looking especially at any user-facing parts of our applications, at the APIs that we expose, seeing when traffic is spiking, what traffic is spiking in order to do, and trying to correlate that with events that we see coming from our customer systems so that we can understand, hey, this is most useful when X is happening. Why is that? And use that to kick off those conversations about what people are using, where we need to build out more support, what things they wish they had that they don't have yet. I think also, though, to come full circle to just that development process, I think we actually use tracing on my team quite a lot to monitor new parts of our platform as we roll it out. Look at that performance, understanding what's happening throughout that distributed architecture, and root causing issues even in early dev and test environments to make sure that we resolve them before they go out to customers. So I really enjoyed working with my team. They're great at using traces. Again, I hope people continue to invest in those, especially early in the development process.
I am with you. And Adriana, I think you would agree, more tracing for everybody. And how do you, as a senior developer advocate, how do you put observability data to work?
It's kind of an interesting couple of use cases that I can think of. I guess on the one hand, I put observability data to work when, say, I'm working on a demo for something that I if we're partnering with another organization, for example, and we're trying to POC something. I found myself at times basically working on a POC and trying to debug it, and then I have a little voice in my head going, oh, you can't see it in the observability system. You haven't instrumented it properly. And so I'm trying to make sure that I follow the advice that I give to other people in terms of troubleshooting. But then there's also using observability, I guess, in a more abstract manner, which is when speaking with different organizations, even within the open telemetry community. For example, so I'm part of the end user working group in open telemetry. And one of the things that we do is bring users of open telemetry together to talk about how they use it in real life. And sometimes it involves giving advice on how to best use instrumentation. So it's not so much me using the instrumentation personally in that case, but rather educating other folks on how to instrument their code to get that observability, to get those observability superpowers.
Yes, that education is so, so critical, especially for folks who don't work at observability companies like us, who don't have the luxury of thinking about this stuff day in and day out. So with that, we've covered the past, we've covered the present. Let us gaze into the crystal ball of the future and wrap up with a prediction for the future of observability, from either adoption to career titles like observability engineer, tooling advancements, or your far-fetched theories. Adriana, would you like to share your prediction for this year or the next 2 years of observability?
Yeah, definitely. So two things come to mind. First of all, my prediction is that observability won't be a separate thing from software delivery. It's something that should be baked into development, QA, and SRE. So it should not be off on its own little corner, because it's essential to all three. And on the same thread of observability being essential to QA, one of my predictions is that trace-based testing is going to become a big thing. And for those in our those of our listeners who are unfamiliar with trace-based testing, it is basically leveraging existing traces to create test cases. So I guess the most common use cases for QA is to leverage traces to create assertions for their integration tests. And there are a bunch of really cool tools out there that are worth giving a shout out. There's Trace Test, Helios, and Malabai. So I'm hoping that there are others out there that I'm not even aware of. I really want to see a growth in trace-based testing, because I really think it's going to really help give everyone super duper powers in observability.
Lovely. We've got 2 good predictions on the table. Amy, what is your big vision that you see for observability in the next year?
I think it's something like on making better sense of the data, especially when it comes from disparate sources. That's something I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately, is like, how can my observability, just like build my architecture diagrams for me, and in a way that's showing both what it looks like and kind of like what where the problems might be in a cohesive way. I feel like it's hard. It's easy to get those in pockets, but getting that in a way that for larger systems as a whole has been challenging. And I really like to, I'm excited that, like, the more that we're doing with, say, like distributed tracing, I feel like we're getting there, but it's still not even for an observability company, like we don't just have a place where we can go and see that.
And I'll add to that. I would love to see not only the real-time architecture diagram, but also would love to see the historical evolution, to go back in time and see how an architecture for a particular part of the stack changed. That would be a fascinating journey at New Relic, to watch the Ruby on Rails explode into a constellation of complexity. And Julia, putting your product manager hat on, I'm very curious what predictions you've got for the future of observability.
Gosh, can I say 2 predictions for the future of observability, Paige?
You may.
So I think, one, tactically, I see observability evolving to a place where it really is elastic in terms of the amount and level of information it collects depending on the context. So I see observability becoming context aware and saying, I see a trend line here, I'm going to turn up the log level for you, or I see that the crisis seems to have passed, I'm going to turn this down, I'm going to collect less because now we're out of this moment. I think there's a lot of manual work still when it comes to making an observability system responsive. I think that's often why we end up with the more data is better data, because you just don't know when the crisis is going to come. But I hope our observability systems evolve and say, hey, we can actually see when the crisis is coming, and we're going to help manage that for you, and also manage the wind down for you, so that you're never paying for more than you need to have. So I think that's kind of my tactical prediction for all of our systems in the next couple of years. I think my strategic prediction, if I can put that hat on for a moment, is that we see a clearer path for observability officers or for observability teams to be a core component of operations teams. I think you have COOs at traditional companies. I don't think you're going to be able to be a COO unless you have a deep understanding of observability and what it's telling you about your company. More and more companies, even those that have a lot of brick and mortar operations, run on software, and that software gives you a lot of insight into your business. So I just see a really interesting growth path from observability manager to chief operating officer, and back down that pipeline, COOs relying on their observability teams for strategic insights as they plan out their business growth and operations every year.
Ooh, take me to this future. I want to live in the future you have all painted for us. And maybe Chief Operating Officer becomes Chief Observability Officer. We can dream. Well, thank you to everybody for joining us, and especially to our fabulous expert panelists, Amy, Adriana, and Julia. It has been a wonderful conversation, and I think many people are going to learn from the insights that you shared with us today. Thank you.